hoş geldiniz. Dear guests, welcome. It's going to be an English presentation.
Sorry.
That's fine. The medium of instruction is in English in this university, so that's not a big problem. So in this very special evening, we got together to listen to Jeff Jarvis, and he'll be talking on digital democracy. And I would like to thank him for accepting our request to become a brand school seminar speaker and the 10th Domino lecturer. As you probably know, Domino lecture series is part of Media MA program's theory course. And as soon as the idea of having Jeff Jarvis as a guest in Turkey in our university, actually we decided not to miss the grand opportunity to co-invite him along with the brand school. So here I am as a program coordinator of Media and Communication Systems MA program, performing my customary duty to present our speakers to our grad students and to whomever happens to be here listening to us. But before doing so, let me thank to Brand School and to our partner institution MediaCat for providing our students with this opportunity. Thank you very much. Okay, Jeff Jarvis is actually the author of Public Parts: How Sharing in the Digital Age Improves the Way We Work and Live, which came out in 2011 from Simon & Schuster, and What Would Google Do, which actually came out earlier in 2009 from HarperCollins. I must confess, actually, I have not been a reader of what Jeff have written so far to the date, but as soon as I read the little Amazon.com editorial review on his Gutenberg the Geek, I definitely decided to become one immediately, and I do agree with the review that Gutenberg should be defined as a world-changing techno-entrepreneur and innovator of the age he lived. So Jeff Jarvis writes on media and news at buzzmachine.com, which I read, by the way. So I'm not totally blind to Jeff. So it's a blog that he directs. He is also an associate professor and director of the Tao Knight Center for Entrepreneurial Journalism at CUNY, the City University of New York's Grad School of Journalism. He is consulting editor and a partner at Playlife. It's a new startup. He consults for media companies, which I kind of like, there's so many of them, so yes, I'm not going to count. The names include the New York Times, etc., etc. And he is a public speaker. He spoke for, again, Axel Springer, USA Today, Time Warner, Edelman, BBC, News Corp, GM, and so on and so on and so on. And and for BİLGİ, I should happily add. Until 2005, he was president and creative director of Advance.net, the online arm of Advance Publications. And prior to that, he was the creator and founding editor of Entertainment Weekly, Sunday editor and associate publisher of the New York Daily News, TV critic for TV Guide and People, a columnist on San Francisco Examiner, assistant city editor and reporter for Chicago Tribune, reporter for Chicago Today, etc., etc., etc. So you're here not to listen to me, obviously. As I said, we are very lucky to have Professor Jarvis here tonight, and I'm positive that we will enjoy a very illuminating talk on a hot issue, a very hot issue for Turkey. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Jeff Jarvis.
Thank you. Good day. I'm delighted to be here. I'm ashamed to say this is my first time in Istanbul. I spent 6 hours this morning just walking around and enjoying your wonderful city, and thank you for the weather. It's been glorious. So yes, Gutenberg. I want to start with Gutenberg. When I wrote the book Public Parts, which is about the value of publicness, not just about privacy, especially in Europe, there's a lot of talk about privacy and fear of technology around that. But I also realized that Gutenberg created the means for us to be public, and all of us, at some level, at some point, to be public. And so I got enthralled with the story of Gutenberg. By the way, I should mention that I'm a New Yorker, so I normally talk very, very fast. So you feel free to just raise your hand at any point and say, slow down. My own grandmother used to do it for me, so you can too. So Gutenberg fascinated me because I realized I teach entrepreneurial journalism, as was mentioned, so I teach journalists to start businesses because somebody's got to hire us, and somehow we have to make a living at this, and so we have to reinvent what journalism is. So I realized that Gutenberg was the first technology entrepreneur. He had to solve all kinds of technology problems to make printing work. It wasn't just the press. That had already been done for wine and olives. He had to perfect, first and foremost, the handheld mold that made it possible to mold type fonts very quickly so he could scale and do that fast. And do the fonts so they were exactly the same line so they would appear together. He had to perfect the metal behind that, the ink behind it, the paper, how thick the paper was, all kinds of technology challenges to figure out printing. Then he also had to figure out the economics of it because his was really, in a sense, the first business technology-based that depended upon capital to survive. This wasn't like making a pair of shoes. You come in, you ask me to make a pair of shoes, I make the shoes. You give me the money, I give you the shoes. Easy, right? Scribes. You hired one scribe to do one book for one patron. That was the business model of publishing. Now suddenly Gutenberg had to go in and find the money to be able to build the press, invent the mold for the type, hire people, get space. He had to import paper from Italy. He went through tons and tons of efforts, and he really was the first, I think, technology entrepreneur. He was Steve Jobs of his day, or I prefer to think he was Sir Tim Berners-Lee of his day. So the important thing to realize about Gutenberg, though, is that the changes that he brought did not happen immediately. The first books were meant to mimic scribes' books, right? The first font, the typeface that Gutenberg invented was meant to look like scribes' handwriting. In fact, printing was originally called automated writing because they wanted it to look like what was. The business models were the same. The content was the same. It wasn't really something new yet. It took fully 50 years for the book to take on its own shape before new inventions like the index were made and things like that. So Elizabeth Eisenstein, who's a key scholar of Gutenberg, says it took 100 years, a full century, before the impact of the press was really known, the book was really known in society. And I'm reading right now a history of newspapers. It's not terribly fascinating, but I'm reading it anyway because it's what I do. And it makes clear that the first newspaper did not come until 150 years after the invention of the press. Now think about that. We would today think that this is an obvious invention. Now this thing called the press exists. Surely someone's going to make a business out of telling people what's happening in the world, right? It took 150 years. One reason for that, as this book makes clear by Andrew Pettigrew, that it also required the establishment of a postal system so news could get around. And originally, of course, when people paid for correspondence elsewhere to report the news for them, they didn't want to tell everybody. This was their private information, so they could take advantage of it and exploit it economically. It was only later, after the press and the postal service came together, that some people started to see that they could make money by printing newspapers. And the first newspapers were not about local news at all. They were about international news because that's where the economic value was. What's coming in on the ships from Venice to Amsterdam, and how can I take advantage of that, right? So the reason I go through all this Gutenberg thing, because besides the fact that I'm fascinated by Gutenberg, and you can all buy my Kindle Signal for only 99 cents, auf Deutsch for a little more. The reason I do all that is to say that we don't know what the hell the internet is yet. If it took 50 years for the book to take its shape, 100 years for its impact to be felt, 150 years to invent something as fundamental as a newspaper, then it is way too soon to say that we know what the internet is. It's too soon to limit it by defining it. It is way too soon to limit it by regulating it, which not only your government is trying to do. Governments across the world are trying to define, thus limit, thus regulate, thus control the net. And there's a lot of danger in that. And we'll talk about that as we go here. I kind of threw out everything I was going to talk about beforehand as we talked before, because I realized more about the audience here. So I hope that we're heading on the right path. Feel free to stick in any moment at all. Don't stand back at all. So my first and major point is that the internet is too young and too early to limit it. So we have to fight for the freedom of the net, not just for freedom of speech, but also for freedom of innovation. Since we don't know what it is yet, we don't know what the invention is. What is that new invention, like a newspaper, that's going to take 150 years to create on the net? We define the future in the terms of the past, right? Printing was called automated writing. In English, we called automobiles horseless carriages, carriages without horses. We called refrigerators ice boxes, boxes with ice. Well, that's because we didn't know how to define these new things, these new analogs as we went. So what the hell is the internet? We don't know yet. Now, as a result, I think it means, now I'm a journalist, I know not all of you are journalists, but we're all in media of one form or another, and communications of one form or another. So I'll tend to think in journalistic terms and media terms, but I also care about the business of journalism. So I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and I've been defining my thinking in three areas: new relationships, new forms, and new models, new business models for media. So I'd like to go through and give you some examples of what I think are some givens today about media in terms of relationships, forms, and models. And then come back around and talk about the internet a bit, and then we can discuss. And the sooner we discuss, the happier I'll be, all right? So, relationships. When students come into my class at CUNY and they want to talk about a story they want to write, they often start with the phrase, I want to write about the music scene in Brooklyn. And I tell them that nobody gives a shit what they want to do except maybe their mother. That's not what journalists do, right? Journalists are here to serve a community that's out there. But we tend to think it's always about us, right? And if you look at the earliest renditions of the internet, we've brought over the business models and the measurements, the metrics of our old media into the new world, because we presume that it's about us. So in old media, I don't know how well this translates, but we talk about reach and frequency. Right? How many people do you reach? How often do you reach them? With your message, whether that message is marketing or journalistic. Reach and frequency. Online, what do we talk about? We talk about unique users and page views. Exactly the same. Reach and frequency. And what that really is a very egotistical model that says, but enough about you, what do you think about me and my content? Do you like my content? Do you come back and read it a lot? Do you hit like button for it? Do you share it? It's all about us. It's very egocentric of us and how we look at media online. And we tend to think that what existed in our old worlds now exists in this new world of the net. So I think it's as fundamental as this. We in media think we are in the business of making something we call content. And I think that's wrong. Content fills something, a page. Service accomplishes something. There's a wonderful philosopher at the University of Southern Denmark named Thomas Pettit who talks about, I'm going to go back to Gutenberg now, what he calls the Gutenberg parentheses. And he says that before Gutenberg, knowledge was passed around person to person, mouth to mouth. Indeed, before printing, or when printing came along, people didn't trust what was printed. They trusted when they talked to a person and they knew your reputation and what you had to say. This anonymous thing came in on paper and there was no reason to trust that. Now we think the opposite. Now we say that what people say is rumor. What's printed is authority. Before Gutenberg, knowledge was passed from person to person. It was changed along the way. There was very little sense of authorship. You know, who wrote this? Very little sense of ownership. The business model, as I said earlier, was a scribe's business model. One book, one scribe, one patron. Then along came Gutenberg, and eventually everything changed, including the way we look at the world. We tend to look at the world, as Marshall McLuhan says, with the model of the line. This sentence is an example. Everything is a linear model, right? And so lines have beginnings and ends, not in math, but they do in journalism, in media, right? There's a beginning and an end. We're storytellers, we say. The business model involves risk, as I said with Gutenberg. There's a very high sense of ownership and authorship. That's when copyright was invented, was because of the Gutenberg age. This idea that I could own something I wrote and you had to buy it from me, and you didn't have the right to make copies of it unless I authorized you to. Before Gutenberg, the aim of the scribes was to preserve ancient knowledge. After Gutenberg, it was to encourage current knowledge and to end up with professors and universities and books and all that kind of good stuff, right? The business model, as I said, was one based on risk and ownership. That's the metaphor, is that you own things. And of course, you can't own ideas and you can't own information, but we in media like to think that you can own the treatment of it and everything that's special about it. Well, so now we come to the internet, Pettit says, and we come past this idea of the linear age of Gutenberg after 600 years. And he says we're going to go back to a more natural state of being before Gutenberg, when knowledge is now passed around again, mouth to mouth or click to click. It's remixed along the way and changed. There's very little sense of ownership and authorship. Thus, we're getting into fights about copyright. The business model is uncertain as can be. Nothing says that we're going to preserve the old business model of old media in this new world. And rather than trying to preserve ancient knowledge or encourage present knowledge from stars like professors, now David Weinberger says the smartest person in the room isn't anyone, it's the room itself. It's the network that makes it all possible for you all to connect. And that's what makes things smarter. So let's imagine for a minute that we in media are not in the content business. That kind of tears apart a lot of our assumptions about what we do, right? We learn the skills of making paragraphs, making stories, making images that add together into a controlled narrative, a narrative that we control. And we think that that's our role, is to be the storyteller. Whether you're in journalism or you're in media or you're in marketing even, we have a message to give. How many people paid attention to our message? Bullshit. We have to start with the public. And if we truly start with the public, then that changes the entire equation of what we do. At CUNY, we're right now trying to start a new degree in what I call social journalism. We have journalism, we have entrepreneurial journalism to teach journalists to start businesses. And the third degree we're trying to start right now is called social journalism, about engagement. And it's really hard as I describe this to people. Engagement sounds like how many people clicked like, how many friends do you have, how often was it shared, how many comments did you get? But those are all still measurements of our editorial ego. How much attention did you pay to my stuff? Bullshit. What journalism should be is serving the needs of a community. And that means the primary skill is first to listen to the community, to hear what the community needs, whether the community says so directly or whether you intuit that, whether you judge what the community needs by working with the community. So probably anthropologists have more to do with what I think journalism will become than storytellers. You're working with communities, you're getting to know communities, you get to know them. So that's one notion of the relationship. Another one is that we live in ecosystems. The business of media for a long time, for a century or more, has been about vertically integrated, controlled corporations. And mind you, I teach entrepreneurship. I'm a capitalist. I'm okay with companies. I'm not against them. But the idea that in a market like the one where I grew up in Chicago, you had one or two newspapers controlling everything. And they controlled the whole process. What to write about, how to write about it, the publishing, the printing of it, the distribution of it, the advertising support of it. Everything was controlled by one company. Well, now we live in media ecosystems where there are many, many players who operate in many different ways and many different business models. Now, I don't know how big blogging has become here in Turkey. In the US, it took off because we Americans like to have opinions about everything. And blogging became a very convenient way for us to do that for the whole world. One of my German friends said, when I questioned my German friends about why blogging isn't big in Germany, one of my German friends said, I don't care what kind of ice cream you like, Jeff. It still sounds egotistical, but it is a way to publish to the world and talk to the world. So I live in the state of New Jersey, which is west of, was The Sopranos on TV here? My state. Okay? Don't give me any shit, people. So that's where I'm from now. That's where I live now, is New Jersey. And we've never really had our own media because we're surrounded by New York and Philadelphia. And so the internet gives us the opportunity now to have our own media in the state. And so we're working with an ecosystem of about 50 sites. The big old newspaper, local blogs, journalists who left their jobs to do something new, a blog just about moms in one town, blogs about food. So they all work together in an ecosystem. And Sir Tim Berners-Lee's amazing invention of the link enables them to work together. And it changes the inherent relationship of what they are together and what they are individually. Because if you were a big old newspaper, you had to deliver the entire world to everyone every day. It was a miracle you could do that, but that's what we did. Now, in an ecosystem, I say, you should do what you do best and link to the rest. You can't afford to be everything, to do everything for everyone. In fact, you're going to do a bad job of it. So the local paper should be local. And if you want the world in English, you'll go to the BBC or the Guardian or the New York Times or Reuters and so on and so forth. But if you want to know about Cleveland, Ohio, you should go to the Cleveland paper, and they should do a great job of giving you Cleveland, Ohio. If you want to know about various sports, you can find the opportunity there too. You find specialization. So this notion of the ecosystem means that if you do what you do best and link to the rest, it has a few implications. One is that you specialize. It doesn't pay to be the 10th best at something because you'll be past the Google front page. You won't be recommended. You have to be the first, second, or maybe third best at something. If you're not, don't bother. Now, we're not paying attention to that in media. If you go to Google News and search on any given story, you'll see 500 versions of the story. Because that's what we think we do in media, is we make content, and we all have to make it. That's economically unsustainable. So the second thing that happens then is if you specialize, it also means you can become more efficient. You become cheaper because you're concentrating on less. You do it better. More people come to you because you're the best at it. That's a fundamental change in how we operate from big old media where we controlled and did everything. And I would argue that in some markets where you have government-controlled media across Europe, that's going to limit the evolution of media because it can still be supported by tax dollars and government control. But we'll get back to that. So, relationships. So you have a new relationship with your community. You have a new relationship with each other in your ecosystem. It also means that we as journalists can think in different ways. Now, in America, we came up with a view that journalists should be objective. They shouldn't have opinions. That's really an economic decision, because when TV came along in the 1950s and killed newspapers in towns, we never really had national media until then, because our towns were too far away for a train or a truck to travel every day, right? Europe, you had a lot of national media, and thus competitive national voices. We didn't have that. So when television came in, it killed the second or third paper in towns. You ended up with one newspaper, and that one newspaper wanted to serve everybody because it was a bigger business. They were a monopoly. So it made them into this cold, dull, institutional voice that we called objectivity. Well, I think that goes away. Indeed, I think it has to go away. And I would argue that we as journalists have to be advocates, and that we always have been. When, as a journalist, we chose what story to cover, that was an act of advocacy. When you chose to cover a murder in this neighborhood but not that neighborhood, you were giving a priority to this neighborhood over that one. When you chose to fight for the little guy, you were advocating. So I think that we can become advocates in journalism again, that we're naturally advocates, and that's where we'll be. That also changes the relationship that we have in journalism. Now, beyond journalism, I know I warned you I'd yammer on a lot about journalism. In media as a whole, it also changes the relationship that brands have with the public. I started a case accidentally some years ago, I think 2005, where I complained about my Dell computer online. And I said, and I quote in my headline, "Dell sucks." And I was not doing it to try to make any big point. I was just frustrated with trying to get the computer fixed. And I was not an influencer in computers or gadgets, but it took off like crazy. Because a lot of people said, yeah, what he says, Dell sucks. And they followed after me like villagers with pitchforks and torches and said, let's go get Dell. It's not my fault that Dell's stock went down 20%. I swear, it's not my fault. But what happened was that I wasn't influential, but my message was. My message, people gathered around. And Dell, their first response was, oh, we don't deal with people in the blogs. No, we don't touch them. They can come here and talk to us if they want to, but we don't go to them. Well, it was a disaster. And a year later, Michael Dell came back in and changed the way Dell does things, such that they created their own blog with a human voice. They hired technicians to go and read blogs, and if somebody had a complaint about their computer, they'd go and say, oh, let me fix your computer. Yeah. And then the next day, what would you do? You'd say, shit, Dell fixed my computer. So Dell went from having a very bad reputation to having a good reputation. Now, they didn't fix all their other problems, like being on Windows, but I'm a proud user of a Chromebook. But it changed the relationship of the brand to the individual, right? It became a personal relationship. One more point about this. Fundamentally, what we're all about, in fact, I'm glad your department isn't named this, but many departments like yours are named mass media. As the sociologist Raymond Williams says, there are no masses, only ways to see people as masses. I'm not a mass, you're not a mass, you're not a mass, we're individuals. But media could only see us as a mass because it could only make this Gutenberg miracle of giving everyone the same product every day. And that created the economics of media, right? Reach and frequency. A lot of people seeing our stuff. And we brought that over into online. So we still see people as a mass. So most news sites that I know still give people the same 300 to 500 pieces of content every day, as if they're not individuals. Now, I don't much like sports, but the New York Times gives me sports every day. I do read boring media stories that no one else wants to read, but they don't tell me that every day. I've got to go digging for it. That's foolish. So I think at some level, that's not my phone, it's somebody else's phone. Is that your phone? It's your phone. Oh, okay. You don't want, I cannot be, oh, you want it up there?
No, it was a voice recorder.
Oh, I'm sorry. Clunk. See, this is my neuroses. I can't be more than 3 feet away from my phone. It'd be like being away from my baby, right? No. No, well, almost. It's Android. Good book. No, I have a Nexus 5. I live La Vida Google. Where was I? Oh, right. So Google, big, giant, huge American conglomerate, monstrous, big Google, knows me as an individual. Every day I use Waze. You know that, the traffic application? To get back and forth. I hear your traffic here is god-awful. True? By the way, tomorrow I've got to go from the Four Seasons to the airport. How long is that going to take me at 5 o'clock in the evening?
You can't.
Don't tell me that. How long, really? 1.5 hours? I'm nervous. See, I'm very neurotic and very nervous. So I'll be on Waze, nervously looking at that. Now, the result of this, by using Waze, is that Google knows where I go, and I'm okay with that. Google knows where I live and where I work. As a result, Google gives me greater relevance, right? When I ask for pizza, Google gives me pizza near me. When I ask for the weather, Google will say, do you want the weather at home? My local newspaper doesn't know that about me. That's ridiculous. Brands where I bought stuff from them don't do that about me. Google does. Now, I know here in Europe, some of you will start complaining about privacy, and we can have that argument another time. I would argue that relevance also matters. Reducing noise matters. And Google manages to do that in ways that news media don't, because news media still treat us as a mass. All right, 2 more topics pretty quickly, and then we'll talk. The next is forms. So relationships, now forms. We tend to think, again, that we are storytellers, right? Whether we make articles or films or commercials, we tell stories. Okay, sometimes we are. But that's only one tool that we have. And a story is a way that we control the narrative, literally. It's our narrative to tell. If we start with the public and we say, what does the public need to know? What do you need to know to have a better life? Then there are many tools that I can use to get you that information. Stories are one way, but they're not always the most efficient way. Sometimes it's data. Sometimes it's connecting you with other people who have the same needs, platforms. Sometimes it's tools. These are all ways that we can get you the information you need, the means you need to improve your life. So this idea of the article, now in the US we teach what we call the inverted pyramid. Do you teach that here? Right, so you start with what's new, then what's the story really about? We call it the nut paragraph. Then an explainer and a backgrounder, and then some quotes and some examples, and so on and so forth, right? And the reason it was shaped like that was because in the old days of hot type of lead, which I'm old enough to have worked in, you never knew whether your story was going to fit or not. So you had to be ready for the bottom just to be cut off unceremoniously. That's why in old newspaper stories, you never had a punchline to a joke at the end of the story, because the end of the story might be gone, and you had no control over this. So we invented this form, and it's really pretty handy. We still teach it because it teaches students how to organize a narrative and prioritize and so on. So that's great. Well, now look at the background paragraph. Every student is told to have a paragraph that gives the background, right? But this doesn't serve anyone well. If you know the story, it wastes your time, and you got to skip over it. If you don't know the story, then you can't possibly understand Syria in 5 lines of type. So what should a background paragraph be now? Online. A link, exactly. To what? To what? Who said link? You're cheating. To what? You know. What do we often go to? If we go to a story, a new story is breaking, and we don't really understand it or know what's going on, or we got to get some background, we didn't pay attention to it, where can we go and get a quick fill-in? Wikipedia, exactly. Exactly. If you want the absolute latest on a story, unless your government has censored this platform, where do you go? Google, Twitter, I think, right? There's other places too, right? And what happens is we're now tearing apart, we're unbundling the article. We've already unbundled the publication, right? The idea that you could get this entire thing that's packaged by an editor is gone, right? Because we go straight to articles from social or from Google or from wherever. Indeed, the New York Times just came out with a report about their digital future, and they're in a panic because traffic to their homepage is going down. That's what editors do. We present the world to you. Oh my God. Well, most American news sites I know have as low as 10% traffic a day. 10% of the audience in a day goes to the homepage. Most people don't even bother to see what we package for them. They don't care because they're going straight to articles from Twitter or wherever. So we've already unbundled the publication. Now we're going to unbundle, tear apart the article. You go to Wikipedia, you go to Twitter, you go here, you go there. Now there's a business opportunity in that. Have you all heard of Vox.com in the US? Vox is making it a business to make backgrounders on stories. So like Wikipedia, but better packaged. So now you start to get into the idea that you have different assets as part of what this is, rather than the whole. So really quickly on forms, we change the relationship. That has an impact on how we change the forms of what we do because our goals are different. Then on to business models for a few minutes. How's the business of news here in Turkey? Well, bad, right? So universal, right? The internet is a universal. Its impact is different in every country, but the timing is different. But I think that the nature of the net is universal, and it's going to have an impact on these old media models. I teach journalists to start businesses of their own. Now, in fact, if you specialize, you can start a blog covering a town or a neighborhood and make a business of it today. We found American journalists who started this who cover a town of 50, 60,000 people. Few of them, not many of them, but a few of them who can bring in revenue, advertising revenue of upwards of $250,000 a year. It's really hard work, it's really difficult, but you can cover a town, a community, a topic, an industry, and you can make a go of it as what I would say is a beat business, a journalistic entrepreneur. You can start your own media enterprises, and I think that's an important thing. How are they supported? Well, still advertising mainly, though advertising will have to change as well. But at a local level, I think it stays pretty much the same as you want to know what's going on locally. Also, we're finding events. Local sites are holding events. They're doing data. They're doing education. They're selling some products directly. All these are ways to add up to a living. It's very, very, very hard, but I do think that it is still doable. At a large level, nationally, we see that there are companies that can come in and compete with the old guys because the new companies can think in new ways. In the US, we see things like Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, Vox is starting up, lots of new entries because they can specialize, they can do something really well, do not as much of it, have much, much, much lower cost, and they can make it work as an enterprise. So I think we see a world where there are new relationships, new forms, and new models for media across the board. Now, back to the net. This can't happen if we don't have the freedom to innovate. Eric Schmidt talks about the beginnings of Apple and Google and says that they were able to start because they had ideas and connectivity and they didn't have to ask anyone permission. That is the essence of innovation. Not asking permission, just trying and failing. You're guaranteed to fail a lot of the time. You have to have the courage to do that. You have to have the vision to do that. You have to have the ability, once again, to listen to your customers so you learn from them as soon as possible, but you don't ask permission. Well, of course, here in Turkey, you're forced to ask permission, right? And I want to hear from you what the chill is, not only on speech, but also on innovation, and thus on the business of media. Because if you can't know that you could start a new media business on top of Twitter for the fear that Twitter is going to go away, you certainly can't start one on top of YouTube. If people are starting new media businesses on top of YouTube in the US, you can't, right? How long has YouTube been shut off? Right. But now you also have the uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen. As we would say, there's a chill. Even if it does come back, even if it seems to be okay, are you going to build a business on top of that for the fear that it could go off again? That's chilling. That's frightening. So I don't know how to put myself in your shoes. I am aware of how lucky I am to be an American, not only because it gives me the English language, and so I'm really shitty in other languages, and I apologize for that. I have certain freedoms that, even though they're being abused, and by the way, as an American, I apologize about the NSA. We have not only a First Amendment, we also have something called Section 230 of a different law that says that proprietors of internet services are not responsible for content they don't create. So something like the right to be forgotten in Europe, I find to be absolutely scary when it comes to freedom of speech, because there's two sides to something. And if you're telling me that I can't, if you want to come along and say that I'm a jerk, you have a right to do so. But if I complain to Google and say, no, take that down, and they do, because they're scared of some court, right, then your right of free speech has been cut off. There's two sides in any transaction of speech. You could say that I came to Turkey and I put everybody to sleep and they were all bored. And I say, I don't like that. But that's knowledge. It's also the hot room, I think. Right? That's knowledge, and you can't limit knowledge. You can't erase knowledge. Erasing knowledge is what tyrannical governments try to do. And so what we're seeing is, even in the guise of what sounds like a good cause, the right to be forgotten, what you're seeing is a government, the EU, the entire EU, is trying to make it possible to erase knowledge. Good God, shouldn't Europeans of all people know better than that? But it sets this precedent. What we're finding is that it's not just about political control, which you're wrestling with. It's also about what I would call techno-panic, the fear of technology, the fear of the change that it brings. And let's now talk about privacy for just a minute. When Gutenberg, I love Gutenberg, I'll bring him up every time I can. When Gutenberg invented his press, some authors were frightened of this idea of having their ideas set down permanently, spread widely under their names. Jonathan Swift, the author, said that, and I quote loosely here, he said that a book of verses kept in a drawer and shown to a few is like a virgin much sought after. But a book once printed is like a common whore anyone can buy for 2 crowns. This idea of being public was not necessarily welcomed, even by authors in the early days. It's scary. Governments tried to control printing. They tried to create government monopolies for printing. And various studies have found that those governments that tried to limit printing retarded the development of their nations, societies, civilizations, and economies as a result. And that's what's happening now with the net, for good reasons and bad, both. Where was I? Lost my thread. So, the right to be forgotten. Technopanic, thank you, technopanic. So technopanic. I got it. So I was at Google a while back, and I just did that. I forgot something for a minute, and I turned to somebody in the room. I was at the strategy group at Google, and I turned to somebody in the room, and I just said, oh, sorry, I forgot that. I said, don't get old. And one of the guys at Google, without missing a beat, said, we're working on that. So technopanic. So then I didn't realize until I did my research that the first serious discussion of a legal right to privacy in the United States did not occur until the year 1890. And the cause of that was the invention of a technology, the Kodak camera. Right? Don't worry, it's okay. Right? This thing freaked people out because now the cameras were these big, huge things with chemicals and flashes and fireworks, right? Now you could take this thing out on the street. It wasn't much bigger than that, because that's a show-off, big, expensive camera, right? And suddenly your picture could be taken and it could appear in the penny press, the mass press that was going, and it freaked people out. Technology. But we figured it out, right? We negotiated our norms. What was happening was that society didn't have the norms ready for this, and we had to negotiate that. So what happened when phones got cameras? Right? People said, oh my God, people are going to take it into the bathroom and the locker room and they're going to take pictures. As if this thing could suddenly make us all uncivilized louts and idiots, right? How that shows no faith in mankind, right? So what happened when the next invention came out? Obnoxious moment here. You got it. Ooh. It's not as great as you think. So, might as well turn it on for the fun of it, right? So what happened when this came out? People, oh my God, people are going to go to bathrooms, they're going to take pictures, right? A New York Times columnist wrote that, and he called me to interview me about it, and I said, Nick, nobody wants a picture of your junk, as we say, right? And I said, the fact that you think people do means you're the one who needs to go see the psychiatrist, not me. Why do you think this is going to suddenly make, because it's techno-panic, because our norms and sometimes our laws are not caught up to the reality of technology, and it takes a little while. But you know what? I have faith in you. I have faith in my fellow human beings that we will figure this out. But we have to be given the chance. By the way, this thing is still booting up. It takes a while. Right. So I want to hear about the difficulties of what you're going through in this country around the internet. And I want to propose that what we want to have is a discussion not about the specifics of certain technologies or certain laws or certain fears. We need to have a discussion about the larger principles of an innovative, free society. Because if we can't have that discussion, we can't invent even ludicrous things like this. It's still booting up, by the way. It's still booting up. There we go. Okay, here we go. Okay, class. Take a picture. You're all acting very dull. Okay, hold on. A little more exciting this time. Come on. Okay, class. Take a picture. One more time. Look at the light here. All right. Hold on. Okay, class. Record a video. All right, you gotta wait. 3, 2, 1, you're off. All right. By the way, if anybody thinks that you can do this subtly in a bathroom, forget it. Okay, class, take a picture. It's not gonna work, right? Sorry, you're in front of me. All right. So, principles. In my book, I tried to talk about this discussion of principles, and I proposed 9 principles. And they're the wrong principles, and I'm not saying that they're the right principles. And by the way, I don't want to have one final list. I don't want to have a constitution for the net. I certainly don't want a government for the net. But what I do want is for us to have a discussion of what matters about the net, so we preserve that. So let me just go over those, and then I'll finish. We can start talking. Number 1, we have a right to connect. Can we agree that if my connection is cut off, that is a violation of my human rights? Whether that connection is cut off to the entire internet in Egypt or to YouTube here in Turkey, I would argue that is a violation of our human rights. We need to find a way to have that discussion. Number 2, we have a right to speak. It's a very American way to put it. It's about the First Amendment, but I'm proud of our First Amendment. I think it works. I recommend it highly. So the question is, what does it mean to have a right to speak? Third, we have a right to assemble and act. Don't you know what that means? And having that restricted after the demonstrations in this country, whether you assemble in person or whether you assemble virtually. What we need to have is a discussion in general about the rights of free citizens to assemble and act together. And we need to have a dialogue with government to say, what are you afraid of when it comes to your own citizens? Number 4, I would argue that privacy is an ethic of knowing someone else's information. If I tell you something about me, it's now public to that extent. What happens to that information is now up to you. You have to decide whether or not I said this in privacy or whether I said it publicly. Is it good to spread it for me? Is it bad to spread it for me? Did I want it spread or not? All that's on you now. It's out of my hands. So privacy is a responsibility you have. Publicness is a responsibility of knowing information that others could make use of. I had prostate cancer. Thus, I told the world about my malfunctioning penis. You cannot get more public than this, folks. Now, if I had said that to you in your office, it's been out there, believe me. If I said that to you in your office, then that's the kind of case where you're going to say, oh, well, did Jeff say this in hushed tones, like he needed to tell somebody? Or is he proudly telling this so that you, I said, have you gotten your PSA checked? Have you? Yeah. Okay, good. All right, good. All right, good. You're over the age, you need to.
The score later on. So.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Too much information. Right? But if you found that there are people in the same geographic area who have the same cancer, for example, if none of us shared that, if we all kept that secret, we could lose that valuable information because privacy could get us overboard on that. Number 6, our institutions' information, not our personal information, but our institutions' information, government and companies and universities. Our institutions' information should be open by default and secret by necessity. And there are necessary secrets in the case of government, justice, and defense, in the case of universities and doctors, personal privacy. But in general, as a principle, shouldn't our information in this society be open? Number 7, what's public is a public good. When the EU court said that information could be restricted from being public, that stole from all of us in the public. When in Germany, my friends in Germany got freaked out, in media and government at least, about Google Street View, and they invented, as the Germans are wont to do, a whole new word for this, the Verpixelungsrecht, the right to be pixelated. And thus, you could go in and demand that Germany blur your building, that Google blur your building. Well, that stole from the idea of what's public. I think that's bad. Number 8, all bits are created equal. That's net neutrality. That means that if any bit on the net is stopped or detoured or slowed down or substituted for another, then no bit can be presumed to be free. And finally, number 9, the internet must remain open and distributed, or else it's not the net. If the internet can be controlled, if it can be shut off at any point, it's not the net. The very essence of the net is that it is open and it is distributed. And that is the essence of how it is threatening and disruptive to the institutions of the past, both governments and companies and universities. So I think we have to have this discussion across the world, across the globe, at a level of principles. What are the principles, not of the technology? We're not fighting for technology here. You didn't fight for technology when you used Twitter in the demonstrations here in Turkey. You fought for democracy. You fought for people having an open voice. You happen to use a technology along the way because you have a new technology you can use. Hallelujah. But in the end, I would argue, let's not have the debate about individual technologies because technologies change. Let's have the debate instead about freedom. So that's what I wanted to say, and now I'm really eager to hear from you because you are doing a lot more on this front than we lazy Americans are. So thank you very much. I'm going to change my classes now, if you don't mind. I'll turn it off. So, not questions, but arguments. I love having arguments, love having anything. I'll take a mic around. I'll do it. Good. Questions and arguments. I'm okay with arguments too. You have one. Okay.
Well, I actually, I was not going to ask a question, but I
but
can.
now you got the microphone, so
but
the medium forces something, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Since I have this, I have the opportunity to ask a question. Actually, first of all, thank you very much for this really very, as I have guessed, illuminating talk. I actually would like to ask a rather down-to-earth, non-theoretical question to you regarding the way in which you see and people or your colleagues see the YouTube ban in Turkey from abroad, because we don't have that vision, and I wonder what you would say about it.
I think our views are fairly obvious. We're appalled by it. We're worried about it. We're worried at a larger level, not just about you. We're worried about you, but we're also worried about what we call the balkanization of the net. And that can come from many ways. And again, some motives that are good and some motives that are bad, right? I spoke at the EG8 Sarkozy held before he left office. And I asked him to take a Hippocratic oath, the oath that doctors say that first do no harm. I said, take a Hippocratic oath for the net. And he said, is it harm to protect your children? Is it harm to protect you from pornography? Is it harm to protect your intellectual property? Well, Monsieur le President, depends on how you do it. Yes, it could be. So there are people who think they have good motives to screw with the internet. And there are people with bad motives who screw with the internet. Unfortunately, you find yourself now in the ranks of Iran and China and others who, for bad political motives, are trying to control it. But they do so, oftentimes, under this umbrella of protecting you. Well, do we really need protection from ourselves? I don't think so. I don't believe that. But I think there's plenty of other ways in which the net is being restricted. And so to us, another way, for example, is after the NSA, Brazil wanted to have a law holding all Brazilians' data in Brazil, physically in Brazil, right? Well, let's be honest, that also makes it easier for the Brazilian government to go find out things about you. And it makes it harder for any company to be able to set up an internet service worrying about this country's law versus that country's law versus that country's law versus that country's law, because these companies all say they have to follow local laws. Well, there's also an emerging law of the net. I'll go back to Gutenberg one more time. There's a columnist at the Observer in London named John Naughton who says that we should imagine that we were writing a poll, we're doing a poll, a survey, on a bridge in Mainz, Gutenberg's hometown, in the year 1874, which is about as far away from the creation of the press as we are today from the creation of the commercial web. The commercial web, by the way, came out in October 1994, so we're about a generation away. And he said, ask the good citizens of Mainz whether they think that this press of Gutenberg's will disrupt the Catholic Church, fuel the Reformation, spark the scientific revolution, change our idea of education and thus of childhood itself, and finally, I would add, change our notion of nations. Nah, not going to happen. This little thing? No. Well, it will, if it's allowed to do so. We are making choices right now that could ruin it, that could restrict it, that could mess it up. What I don't know, so I think outside, as much as Americans ever pay attention to anybody else in the world, we're bad at that. Yes, we're worried and appalled and supportive. But it's not our fight to fight, it's your fight to fight. And I don't know I can't advise you of that because I'm not in your situation. I'm not in your danger and your risk from this. I guess I could turn the question back around and say, what should the rest of the world do to help you and support you in this? Next. There's always this awkward moment here. It's hot. Good. Okay. You can reach. Here, I'll do it. There you got it? Okay. All right.
Well, thank you for this wonderful talk, first of all. I was watching, European Parliament elections last night, and, I heard that, for example, France, like 25%, rise in very ultra-right parties, Le Pen's party. It turned out that those, voters are the most, internet users and the, best social media users in the country. So should we lose faith, in the link with the democracy and use of internet? I mean, this is a very depressing data in terms of democracy, right? I have all the faith, on the internet, obviously, but that is a little bit, depressing, don't you think? What is your opinion about that?
Well, I think that if you look in the U.S., because I'm American, so I'll go to there, the far right wing took over talk radio and made talk radio theirs, right? And then on Fox News, they made cable news theirs because it was yammer and talk. And I wondered at one point when that happened whether the internet, the argument in the U.S. is that mass media are essentially left-wing, because they're for the people, and that these new media were essentially right-wing because they were a chance to complain a lot. And so I wondered whether the internet was essentially right or left. And I don't know, but I concluded it's neither. I also wondered whether it was essentially libertarian, kind of anti-government, that's what I'm trying to look for, and anti-authority, right? I don't think that's the case either. I think a lot of libertarians embraced the net immediately. Let's not blame the technology. Let's blame our citizens, our fellow citizens. And what's happened is that some have been very, very good at using technology. Now, some would say, probably in this country, damn this Twitter, right? Erdogan said he wanted to kill Twitter because he didn't like how it was being used by his opponents. It's not the tool, it's the people at the end. Making sense? And so I think that's why I don't want to have the discussion at the level of the technology, because then we get in trouble, right? I'm trying to think of an example of that. Copyright itself, right, was written to a technology that doesn't exist anymore, and we don't know how to deal with that now. Oh, here's a better example. In the US, and I apologize, it's just what I know, we have a right to privacy in our first-class mail only. The presumption is that if you send a postcard, the postman can read it, and so it's not private. If you send cheap mail, it's not private. But if you send a letter, a first-class letter, they have to get a court order to open it. Yeah. Well, so what the fuck happened in the US? Well, that same right didn't extend to other technologies called email and chat and direct message and all these other things. What should have happened is we should have had a discussion of the principle of a right to private communication, period. No mention of technology, that there's a right to that. And then it would cover email and direct message and so on and so forth. So we need to have this discussion not at the level of technology, but at the level of citizenry, I think. And what happened was some people on the far right have seen and exploited the opportunity of these new tools, and others haven't necessarily done the same. Conveniently next door. Could have over there.
Well, thank you so much for this enlightening talk. I'm a senior student in Media and Communications Department.
Good luck for jobs.
Thank you. And I am the current radio coordinator, or college radio coordinator, so I'm too much in this field of experimental media creations. And I've been writing my thesis on DIY, do-it-yourself, the citizenship on digital media, when John Hartley, a professor from Queensland University, came up with the idea that the media is not no more what the mainstream does, it's what we do. So, and you pointed out that in our contemporary media sphere, that it's pointless to measure all this Facebook likes and shares and retweets. But still, I mean, doesn't signify a coherent media message in terms of our digitalization and globalization? Is it really pointless to not measure them and just, disregard them? I think because in terms of measurement, they have a message to give, and it should be tracked somehow.
I'm not against measuring anything, but it's actually tied to the previous question, too, is that anything can be gained. Anything can be exploited, right? So just as talk radio and social media can be exploited by the far right, so can they be exploited by marketers. No offense to those people teaching marketing here, right? And in fact, that's probably part of what you're learning is, how can we go exploit this? I recommend that you read a piece written by Tony Hale, H-A-I-L-E, the founder of Chartbeat. It was written in Time magazine about 2 months ago. And he found that people share before they read. Indeed, they don't read. So the problem is not measuring. The problem is what we impute in the measurement. So we think that, they shared it. They must have really loved it. No, they saw the cute cats and they set it on, right? So sharing, it turns out, from his data is not a good measurement. He also found, by the way, that native advertising, the effort of advertisers to fool us into thinking that content that they make is without bias and is real, he found that when people go to a real story, pardon me for saying it that way, right, 75% of the time they scroll, they engage with the content. If it's native advertising, they only do that 20%, 25% of the time. So there's data to see. But my only caution, yes, measure it all. Yes, report it all. But my caution is don't necessarily assume the meaning of it, especially the meaning of those who would exploit it. So if we look at manipulation of media, right, the first phase that lasted 100 years, more than 100 years since mass media, is let's manipulate the journalists because they hold the gateway to the public. Then for about 10 years, it was let's manipulate search engine results. And SEO came along, and now Google's gotten good enough at fighting that down. Then for about 3 years, I saw a trend in what I would call trying to manipulate influencers. And this idea that there were people out there who had influence. If we just manipulate them, they will carry the day. And yes, that can happen politically to an extent, but I also think that's bad. Now we have the effort to manipulate memes, right, topics as they go by on the net. You always have to be aware of the manipulation that can occur. That's my caution. So yes, measure it. Yes, see what exists. But I think we've got to work very, very hard to reinvent the measurements and ideas of engagement. And indeed, I'm trying to figure out right now a research project. If you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them, for how to do that. But to me, where it starts with is not with our content. It starts with the community. It starts with what the community wants and needs and doesn't know and needs to know and wants to accomplish. And then what we measure is, did we help them in the end accomplish their goals? Along the way, there are these tools called content and media and likes and friends and all this other stuff. But those are just tools along the way to the more important goals, which are the public's own.
Thank you.
Next. Anybody? I know you're tired and hot. Anyone? You're going to embarrass me if you don't stick up your hand. Somebody. Oh, I almost got you, but you were saved.
First of all, when I read about you, you always struck me as like an optimist to a fault, and very
True.
believer in the goodness in the mankind. But that's what I always thought about the internet. Eventually, I thought internet would bring us together, and once the wheel is removed, we can see each other, and we can set up our differences and work for the better future. Yeah, but that did not happen. What I see at the YouTube comments or 4chan. Am I rushing this? Am I rushing this process, or I don't know? Is it, or are you wrong? That's it.
You will know, and I will never know because I'll be dead and gone. Right? If we look at the Gutenberg timetable, right? We're in the year 1472, in Gutenberg years. So I don't know, and the technology does not guarantee good or bad. It can be used by good people. It can be used by bad people. Right? I would argue it was used for good here in Turkey in the demonstrations. It was used for bad in France. Same technologies. That's up to my judgment and your judgment as to whether that's good or bad. You could be the opposite. I don't know. So we don't know. But at the end of the day, yes, I'm an optimist to a fault. Because at the end of the day, if you don't believe in the inherent goodness of your fellow man and woman, then you can't believe in democracy, or free markets, or reform religion, or journalism, or teaching. Why would you inform the masses if they're just a bunch of idiots who are going to misuse it anyway? Right? Why would you all be here? Go make your nails with anvils, It's all you can handle. We don't believe that. Right? We believe that people are inherently good, and that as a society we'll figure it out. Lord knows we've seen that go horribly, horribly bad. But the bad guys, in the end, usually, so far, even after much destruction and pain and horror, get defeated.
You just give us hope for Mr. Erdogan's fate. Thank you.
You know far better than I do. Well, I mean, so what do you think? Do you think there is hope here? I don't want to get you in trouble.
I don't really know. It seems like he's stuck with us.
Beautifully put. May I tweet that? Next, anyone? Yes. No, it's okay, it's okay. I need the exercise. I'm 59 years old. I need the exercise. You're young. You got a few years.
Once again, thank you for the talk. My question is about, do you think we should treat internet as a different entity from the offline world in terms of, you know, the right to speak, in terms of the, I don't know, the laws? Because the thing is there really a difference in speaking out loud in a town square, you know, shouting your ideas, maybe right or wrong, maybe a criminal act in sort of with wrong data, with the, you know, tweeting it online, public to everyone. Do you think there is a difference? Because I'm asking it because when the internet started, it started with the avatars. We most of us didn't use our, you know, persons, real persons. We created these fake persons, and because of that, we did what we wanted to do, basically. But as the years come by and the data is, you know, publicly public everywhere, so we started to use our own persons. For example, Google says that you should have to connect your YouTube account with the, you know, your Google account, so that it should know that you are both the same guy, and both the person that, you know, that writes the negative comment in there, and the guy who has the Google Plus profile. So basically, it's getting more transparent every day. Do you think how long can we keep it this different from the real world? Personally, I don't think it's different at all. And at some point, it will converge to one entity, and it will just become the world as we know it. And for now, do you think we should act them differently?
You asked about 100 questions. All of them good. All of them good. And I wrote a book about a lot of that. So, but I won't sell it to you now. There's a lot of arguments there about. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg says that we have one identity. Other people think we should have multiple identities. We should have the freedom to have many identities. Oh, sorry, I'll stand back here so give everybody a neck crane. I agree with Zuckerberg at the end of the day that we have one identity, but obviously we change it, right? You heard me, I use words like shit and fuck. I don't do that, well, I do it in class, but I don't do that when I'm with I do it with my parents. I don't do that with little kids, right? Because that would be wrong, right? So I might talk about some things in some company and not in others. That's not because I'm inherently different myself. I'm still one person. And in fact, I think what we most fear is that we get caught out as liars. And what we fear is that someone's going to recognize that we're a fraud, that we act this way here and that way there. And my wife says that, she doesn't like being public, so don't tweet my wife says anything. But my wife says that her greatest fear about Facebook is not that people are nasty to each other, but instead that people make up these fantasy visions of their lives that no young person thinks they can live up to. And so they think they're all miserable. Well, her life is great. My life must be really shitty and fucked up. Sorry, I just had to use the words again. So, yeah, I think that what happens in the end is that people think that I believe that everything should be public. You know, I've told you about my penis. For God's sake, it's not going to be more public than this. I don't believe that. I do have private things. This is the ultimate vault of my privacy, right? But I also do see the benefit in being public. When I wrote about my prostate cancer, people came and gave me support and information, and I got to inspire other men to get tested, and I got benefit from this. So I see the benefits in being public. But no one should be forced out of that closet. You know, right? Nonetheless, I think you're right. I think the net does inevitably drag us more and more toward that. Because we do see the benefits, because we are more public, because it has some value. And the other question is, I go to Germany a lot, and the Germans are pretty wacky about privacy, right? The aforementioned Verpixelungsrecht. They went crazy with buzz, and so on. My favorite little story about this is that the first time I went to a German sauna, well, to an American, that was shocking, right? Mixed and naked. We Americans don't do that, right? That's the most ultimate exposure you can imagine as an American. And the Germans were saying, what's the big deal? Macht's nix. And my joke was that online, the Germans care deeply about the privacy of everything except their private parts. Little joke. But what it forces us to do is ask, why is the private private and why is the public public? And what's the value and what's the decision behind those decisions? And that's what I think we have to do as a society, is ask that. So I was talking with a bunch of editors at Die Zeit in Hamburg and about all of this. And one of them said, well, all right, Jarvis, you're right about us Germans and privacy. But he said, my daughters, my teenage daughters, don't operate this way. They operate differently. And so the question I wonder is, are they starting to grow up under an internet culture over a German culture? And I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know what I want the answer to be. I don't want to lose the diversity of all the cultures we have on Earth to one big geek's vision. I don't want us all to be like Mark Zuckerberg, though I like Mark. He's a smart guy. But at some level, yes, we have to recognize that we do start to have now a common thread of communication and structure throughout the entire world. So I guess my only advice is, let's find the advantage in that while still preserving our cultures as we know them. Make sense? It's hard. It's going to be hard. But, you know, the book did the same thing. There's a wonderful bit of research out of McGill University about the idea of the making of the modern public. Now, if you're Habermas, whom I'll misquote, he would argue that the public sphere did not come until the 18th century with the coffee houses and all that. And these academics said, no, actually, we think that this idea of the public came before that. That the creation of the book created publics. The stage play. If you went and saw a Shakespeare play about a corrupt king, you gathered around that idea, even if you didn't talk about it individually. Right? You're all gathered around some ideas about your prime minister. Right? Prime minister? Prime minister. Yeah. Different title. Right? Maps. The map created an idea of, I'm here, not there. This is us, that's them. This is my nation, that's not. Right? That was a big deal. And I was thinking about this the other day. With Google Maps, I never have a sense of the map. I only have a sense of around me. So that's really interesting too, right? Paintings. When the Reformation came and you didn't just paint the Virgin Mary and Jesus, and you guys didn't paint Muhammad, but you did paint people, right? Because unemployed painters had to paint something, so they painted people. Well, now you had a sense of what someone from Amsterdam looks like versus someone from Venice. And you had a chance to say, that's us, that's them. Right, so all these things created publics. Not the public, but publics. And I think what Facebook messed up was the idea that the public and a public are the same thing. If I tell these 5 people something, that doesn't mean I'm telling the whole world, even though you could go around like that, tell the whole world. But that is a public versus the public, broadcasting to the whole world. And we're trying to figure that out as a society. We're nowhere near getting there. So a lot of good questions. No good answers. Anyone else? Anyone? Anyone? Yeah. So I picked on you before.
In Turkey now we have 2 opinions regarding this Twitter bans. One opinion is that it's only the economic reasons to get the taxes from a giant US company. And the second one is the fear of becoming a more hard Islamic republic. So from your point of view, which one would you agree as an American or as a foreigner when you look at Turkey?
I couldn't possibly say, well, let me ask you, which one do you think it is? I'm a teacher and a New Yorker. We always ask questions with questions.
I only think that it's only economic reasons, because in Turkey we've moved very forward in 20 years, maybe in the last 20 years. So I don't think it's too easy to ban everything and become more like Iran or Pakistan, maybe.
Right.
So in deep down, I think it's the only reason, because we know that Google and Microsoft has local, local companies in Turkey which they pay taxes regularly. So this is the most important, maybe the reason for Twitter not paying anything, although they get all maybe the most advertising material, etc.
Couple things. I think there's a lot going on, especially in Europe, about these big American companies not paying their taxes. Right? So I had a debate in The Guardian with a member of parliament who was arguing that Google should just give more. And my argument back was, you don't want Google deciding what taxes are. That's what laws are for. Ma'am, that's your job as a legislator to decide what should be paid. And the fact that you can go to Ireland and the Netherlands and the Bahamas and pay less, the double Dutch sandwich or whatever it's called, right? Well, that's a matter of diplomacy, both of which are government. Government in its laws, its tax laws, and its diplomacy should figure that out. Companies should not decide what they ought to pay. Companies are required by their shareholders to pay as little as possible. They don't just voluntarily say, I think I'm going to give you some more money. That's not a for-profit company. So that means that we've got to get together on this. But I think what's going on is there's a hidden message behind this, right? Which is, in some cases, anti-technology, in some cases, anti-American, in some cases, just anti-change, in some cases, just political exploitation, and so on. So at a shallow level, I think you're right that economics have a lot of this, but I think there's political motives behind a lot of this. There's another interesting idea here, though, that in America, we overdid it with the Arab Spring, I think, in terms of thinking the power of Twitter and social media and all this. And as one of the bloggers I know in Egypt said at the time, Twitter didn't demonstrate against the police. Egyptians did, right? But we tend to think that it's a technology revolution. It's not. It's people who used this for their own ends. If you haven't followed a guy named Andy Carvin, C-A-R-V-I-N, he tweeted the Arab Spring and did a magnificent job of it. We published his book called, I'll remember it later. But I think there's something really, really interesting here. And I don't want to stretch too far because we Americans tend to think, oh, Islamic nations are all the same. Obviously they're not. You are the wonderful miracle of that, of being very, very different. But I think there's something interesting for you as academics to explore, which is the notion of a book culture versus now a social media culture. Elizabeth Eisenstein, who's the key scholar of Gutenberg, one last time, Gutenberg, when I interviewed her, said that Western countries became book cultures because we grew up with it and because of the view of the Bible. And she said Islamic nations didn't have that same culture. They had a different culture based on it. I don't know enough to know how to judge that conclusion. Well, what I can say is currently what you do see is incredible use of social media. Again, they're not Twitter revolutions, but they are revolutions that use social media and use Twitter. It so happens in Islamic nations. Well, what does that say? Does it say anything? Is it just coincidence? Does it say anything about the underlying culture? Does it say anything about the development of those cultures in their times? Well, again, I'm going to be dead and gone before anybody can conclude that, right? The doctorate thesis is going to be written, when you're all professors. But I think there's something interesting to explore there. So at one level, yes, it's economic. At another level, it's political exploitation. But at another level, I just sense there's something going on here about the nature of social media and the nature of a people being able to organize and speak in ways that weren't necessarily a part of their culture over the last 600 years. That's just worth investigating. And I don't know what that means. Does that make any sense? Yep.
Adding on to that, I think like to continue with that discussion, I think I have a tendency to see it in a different light, like the Twitter, trying to tax Twitter. Precisely what you call the book culture. I think the Turkish government is still trying to hold on to that. But I mean something else with the book culture. I mean, when you publish a book, and they think your ideas are threatening to them, they come and get your book, burn it, and then prevent the distribution of it, right?
Right.
So I think they're still living in that mindset. Like, if I know where these people are, where their office is, who works there, very similar way to just going into a publishing house and confiscating the books, I can just get these people. So they still don't see the change, in the culture. Like, they still look at these things through the perspective of the publishing house, I think. Like, that's...
No, I think you're right. In fact, you're reminding me of a point I was going to bring up, but I didn't, which is exactly right, which is that, and this is a point for your argument with your government, the internet is not a medium. And if we think of it as a medium, it brings all those limitations of being a medium, right? A medium has an author and a publisher and an ownership and all these things, right? The internet is not any of those things. The internet, the problem here is if we come up with any analogy, it'll be the wrong one. Horseless carriage, right? Icebox. But if the internet is anything right now, the way I think about it, it's a place. Now that's also scary to governments because the internet is Taksim Square. The internet is a place. It is a street corner where people come together and talk with each other, period. They connect with each other. They have speech. And that speech enables them to organize and act together. That's what the internet really is. So it's not a medium at all. Now, I looked at this in the early days of the net, of the web rather, and when I ran newspaper sites and we put up comments, and I used to defend comments, and I still will to an extent, but basically comments are the places for a few people who need their medication to rant. And so someone would come along in a comment and they would say the word shit. And we journalists would say, they've ruined it, as if some journalist had put the word shit in a story and the entire edition is ruined. My God, our standards are lower, right? Well, no. The internet is a corner it's Taksim Square, it's Times Square, right? It's a place where people just talk. And if you go there and listen to people, you will hear people who are stupid and smart, who are clean and dirty, who are, all kinds of people are there. And they're just talking. That's all it is. And so if you try to say, aha, one person said something we don't like, so let's shut the whole fucking thing down, you're exactly right. That's treating it as if you had the power you had over media. So part of what we have to do is educate governments that it's not a medium. Now, they're not going to like that message, but the basic message to them, where they want to shut down the net and shut down what it can do, is tough shit. You can't. At the end of the day, you can't. You can try and try and try. You can shut down this tool, but it'll come out there. You shut down that tool, but it'll come out here. And at some point, there's no inevitability. Bad guys can use the internet too, whether that's the secret police of Egypt or whether that's the NSA. But at some point, if I trust my fellow man and woman, the truth will out. Things will out, we'll talk. But governments can't control it. So yeah, the tax is just one piece. It's a reflex of thinking you control something that you can't really control anymore, and that's what they hate.
About the taxing issue, there's a huge disinformation, I may say. Maybe friends from media agencies can correct me, but Twitter actually selling ads and gaining revenues by a medium company called Genart Media in Turkey. So they basically pay all their taxes as any media agencies in Turkey. So basically this is a huge disinformation, I think, created by the government to think that the Twitter is stealing our money at some point, but it's not the thing. They want the Twitter office just for the speed to intervene to the content itself, basically. Just correct.
Right. What also happens with these cases is they want to have, if you have an office in the nation as Google in China, then you're forced to follow the laws of that nation in a way that you may not want to. So that's the other issue. So if you're a taxed body, then you can follow those laws, and it's a problem. We're nearing the end, and it's finally getting cool. What miracle happened? some body heat left. I don't know. What is it? What's our timing? And I'm happy to stay as long as you want, but I just want to make sure. You have finals, I think. Anything? One last one. Anyone? No one on that side of the room said a thing because I felt like I ignored you. You know why? It's because you get blinded by that as you go. Anybody? Okay. You're on the other side of the room, of course. No. I'm going to do it. I'm putting you out of a job. I'm sorry.
Well, my question is basically a less political one, and I don't know, but I'm always curious with the reason why we don't quote the name of the inventor of internet, like as much as we quote Zuckerberg or Gutenberg. I mean, I'm really curious about that reason actually. Do you have any ideas about those Bergs versus the inventor of the internet actually?
Well, there's a couple of them. Let me just make a quiz. Who do you mean?
I mean the Dutch guy who actually served the Dutch academician.
Oh, right. Well, I think there's two issues. One is that the internet itself was a team of people, right? DARPA, people like Vint Cerf and others. The web was invented by a British guy, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, thus Sir, right? So the web was invented by him, and people always think that he invented the internet. He didn't. He just invented the web, right? Why do we pay attention to Mark Zuckerberg? Because there was a movie made about him. Because it's colorful, because he's kind of geeky and wacky. And let me tell one last story about Zuckerberg. And this is showing off. I was at Davos, a few years ago, and Zuckerberg was speaking to a room of about this many people in it who were all big moguls of media. And it's Chatham House rules, so you're not supposed to quote them, but I asked Mark if I could quote him, so I'm being okay. But an unnamed, very powerful man who runs a news company very near me in the city where I live and work, right down the street. You know what the square is called. He begged Mark. He said, Mark, how do we get a community like you? We should be able to own a community. How do we build a community? Tell me how. It was that insistent and embarrassing. And Zuckerberg said in response, in full, you can't. And then he gave him that geeky stare like I'm doing right now that kind of scares you, doesn't it? Right? And he came back later and he said, you're asking the wrong question. You don't make communities. Communities are they're already there. They're already doing what they want to do. The question you should ask is, how do you help them do what they want to do better? And his prescription for this was what he called elegant organization. I love that phrase, elegant organization. And he said, if you think about it, Harvard was around for 300 years before young Mark came along. But he did indeed find a way to more elegantly organize the community there and get more people laid. And for which people were grateful. That has something to do with the answer too, right? And so I think that's what our job is in media, is not to organize communities, because they're already there. It's to help them organize themselves with their own knowledge, their own desires, and what they want to do. And so Zuckerberg and Page and Brin and others brilliantly saw this platform, the internet, and that Tim Berners-Lee gave them on the web and what Vint Cerf and Company gave them before that, and saw what they could do with it. And I think that's worth celebrating. But the lesson to you in the end is that you have the same platform, same platforms. You can create new media enterprises, redefining the notion of media, getting past Gutenberg years. You can redefine that. And you, like my entrepreneurial students, can create new enterprises. And you, sir, can be the next Zuckerberg, and then you'll like having the attention. So, well, thank you all very, very, very much.